Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the US presidential elections and how Kamala Harris being the vice presidential pick for the Democratic nominee is relevant to India. We also talk about the life and legacy of the Indian classical giant Pandit Jasraj, who passed away on Monday. But first, we talk about air travel. Even as the pandemic continues, various countries, including India, are slowly lifting their air travel restrictions. Both Indian and foreign airlines are now offering a number of flight options for those who wish to travel abroad. The countries offering such options are limited, and travel is subjected to certain conditions imposed both by India's Ministry of Home Affairs as well as the governments of the destination countries. Right now, if you want to take a flight from India to another country, then India needs to have an agreement with the country you wish to go to. They need to be part of an air travel bubble. In this segment, Pranav Mukul, who reports on aviation for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about how air travel bubbles work, which countries can one travel to right now, and what one would need to do for it. Pranav, could you first talk about what exactly air travel bubbles are and how do they work?
So we know that international air travel operations have been suspended due to COVID for the last 4 to 5 months, and this has been across the globe. So there was a concept that started in Australia and New Zealand of having these air transport arrangements between two countries that deem each other safe to travel. So, these are basically temporary arrangements between two countries that are aimed at restarting commercial passenger services at a time when regular international flights are suspended as a result of the pandemic.
So, which are the countries that India shares an air travel bubble with, this agreement with?
So, India has established air travel bubbles with the US, the UK, France, Germany, the UAE, and Maldives. In fact, Civil Aviation Minister said on Tuesday that India is negotiating such arrangement with 13 other countries, including Australia, Japan, Italy, South Korea, Thailand. So we could see some of those translate into reality soon.
So, like you mentioned, Maldives is one of the countries that India has this agreement with. So, who all from India can go to Maldives right now?
So, for each of these countries that India has the arrangements with, there's also a factor of who these countries allow to travel into their borders. So, for example, the UAE is an exception which is allowing tourists to travel into its borders. But European countries, France, Germany, and even the US, they're still not allowing tourists to come in. They're still continuing with the restrictions that they had imposed earlier. For example, for the US, they're allowing business visa holders, they're allowing students. The UK is also allowing students, business visa holders. In fact, there's a restriction from the Indian side to not allow anyone with a tourist visa to travel outside. So you should either have some kind of special permission to travel, or a business reason, or a medical reason, or you should be traveling for your studies.
And who all is India allowing to come in?
So again, in addition to Indian nationals being allowed to travel on inbound flights that are being operated either by Air India, Indigo, which are the Indian carriers, and the foreign carriers, there are certain categories of foreign nationals also which are allowed to travel into India. Again, in foreign nationals, the categories are basically the same: business visa holders, healthcare professionals, health researchers, anyone with a certain technical expertise that has been invited by a business entity or a university in India. People who are working with manufacturing units who are foreign nationals. These are also allowed to travel into the Indian borders. Till very recently, there were certain restrictions on holders of the Overseas Citizens of India cards, which are the OCI cards. OCI card holders are basically people with foreign passports, but who have been citizens of India previously. So they're given this OCI cards. But now the Indian government has removed all its restrictions on OCI card holders, and all kinds of OCI card holders can now enter India.
So, if I meet the conditions that India has put in place and I meet the conditions of the destination country, what are the kind of things that I need to do if I need to travel?
So, essentially, like I said, each country has its own restrictions in place. Similarly, they also have their own requirements for people coming in. So either they'll have a quarantine or a self-isolation requirement, or they'll have a testing requirement. So for certain countries like the UK, if you're going to the UK from India, there's a compulsory 14-day self-isolation that is required for you to go into the UK, no matter what category. UK has a list of certain countries from which it has allowed exemption of this self-isolation requirement, but that isn't applicable on people coming in from India. Similarly, France has mandated COVID testing for passengers coming into Paris. And if you need to travel to UAE, you'll need an approval from the UAE's Federal Authority for Immigration and Citizenship.
Also, are there any restrictions in place when it comes to domestic air travel in India?
Right now, there are no restrictions on travel as such, but from the airlines point of view, the airlines are still only allowed to operate a small part of their pre-COVID-19 schedule. So right now, airlines are allowed to operate only about just less than half of what they could previously. But that in effect does not really play a role, because airlines have been seeing really low demand for air travel. So an increase in capacity right now from the government's end wouldn't really change a lot of things for airlines.
So, initially during the lockdown, the air travel industry had been eager to open up, having suffered losses. Do we have a sense of, how much this lifting of restrictions, both domestic and foreign, will help the aviation industry, and to what extent have they helped?
So, for the aviation industry, especially airlines, the aircraft need to be in air, the flights need to operate. That is the most essential part. And there can be no recovery without flights restarting. But we must also look at the governments which are trying to exercise caution, trying to prevent another bout of the pandemic in their borders. So, to that extent, there's still some caution that the governments are exercising. But you said rightly that without air travel resuming, the recovery path will still be very patchy for airlines.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Next, we talk about Kamala Harris. Right now, the United States, which has the highest number of COVID-19 cases in the world, is gearing up for its next presidential election, which is due this November. Last week, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden named Kamala Harris as his vice presidential nominee. Harris is the first Asian American and the first Black woman in American history on a major party ticket. Harris's nomination is being seen as relevant to India and is also making news because of her Indian heritage, which comes from her mother, who grew up in India. In this segment, Shubhajit Roy, Indian Express's associate editor and who reports on matters of foreign affairs for the newspaper, joins us to talk about what makes her nomination relevant to India. Shubhajit, before we talk about her politics and how her nomination is relevant to India, I want to talk a bit about her personal identity. Here, in India, people often get excited when someone of Indian origin is appointed or elected to a senior political position elsewhere. But, when we talk about her, how much does she identify with her Indian roots?
Well, she has primarily identified herself as a Black woman, as someone who's of African American heritage. Having said that, she has also talked about her mother, who was an Indian. And her Indian American identity, she has talked about, especially in the last 4 years, when she became a senator. And in each of those speeches or statements or interviews or profiles, she has talked about the Indian American part as well as her connection with India, with her visits to her grandparents' place in Madras, and how that has sort of informed her politics, which she does today. And right now, if you look at all the profiles in the American media, I'm not talking about the Indian media per se, but the American media, even they have acknowledged that she has her roots in African American system as well as the Indian American community. And the media there has also talked up about her identity on both fronts. The reason is because she has also sort of broad-based her identity in the sense that she's also talked about her South Asian ancestry. So essentially appealing to a broader identity, because while the Indian American community is a 4 million strong community there in the United States, it is one of the wealthiest, it is possibly the wealthiest ethnic community, as well as considered the most educated ethnic community in the US. So while that particular community, she's going to tap that particular community for the elections, which Biden is also reaching out to by appointing her. But she's also sort of talked about this entire South Asian community so that that particular base comes to her.
And, when we talk about coming to her potential position as a vice president, and when we talk about her politics, in that sense, how much do we see her nomination as being relevant to India?
She was chosen because of few reasons. And the first one was obviously Joe Biden wanted, and he had publicly always maintained that he wanted a woman as his vice president. That was one of the reasons. That was one of the foremost reasons. The second reason was that Joe Biden was aware that since he is a white East Coast liberal and epitomizes that in that sense, he wanted a West Coast liberal and an African American as well. That's how Kamala Harris was chosen. Apart from that, her experience in administration and politics, as a prosecutor, as a senator, all these became another aspect why she was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. And also, she is closer to moderate left, closer to the centrist position of Biden, which has a broader appeal than the extreme left, hard left, which Bernie Sanders and others represented. So therefore, it was a combination. That's what she brings to the table. The final point that is there is that age is on her side. And that's why, while Biden is 77 years old, Kamala Harris is 55 years old. And a lot of times, Biden has talked about himself as a one-term president, as a bridge president, as a transition president. So which means that Kamala Harris could be the presidential candidate in 2024. And if she wins this particular election, they're able to win this election, then she would have had a 4-year vice presidential experience under her belt. And therefore, she would be the first woman, African American, and Indian American candidate for the next presidential elections. But obviously, 4 years and 3 months is a long time in politics. But right now, the Biden-Harris ticket is aimed at this kind of broader appeal, which will appeal to African Americans, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign and the protests that took place after the death of George Floyd. So in that kind of a fractious polity and society that we see in the US, her candidature is going to be of extreme importance.
And she's someone, given her position as a Democrat, as you mentioned, a bit left of center, she is someone who has, spoken out against human rights concerns. And I was just wondering, in a scenario like this where a US vice president has, these kind of concerns, and, human rights concerns in the West have been raised about, things that, happen in India. So in that sense, when you have someone in a position like this, how much does that influence India to change its own stance and the relationship between the two countries?
Well, candidates, they speak with votes in mind. When they become presidents and vice presidents, they have national interest in mind. So that is the bottom line from where one should see whatever she says right now and whatever she has said. We have enough, it's not a secret. She has been an advocate, a champion of human rights. That has been her politics. On Kashmir, she had once said that when she was asked that we are watching. That was what her quote was at a small meeting sometime late last year. Now, we know her politics. She will definitely be the second most important person in the room when President Biden, if they get elected, she would be the person who would give him counsel. Now, in that kind of situation, the Indian government has been very careful in not commenting or reacting to her candidature or any of her statements so far. In the past, when we have had Democrat presidents like President Obama or President Bill Clinton, we have seen the relationship change, and there has been a bipartisan consensus towards better relations with India. Both Biden and Kamala Harris, both of them in a recent webinar, recent session organized by South Asians for Biden, they emphasized on pluralism, democracy, diversity in India, which is what makes India attractive to the US because of the shared values. Now, that will definitely be part of what Biden said will be an honest conversation. But having said that, ultimately, she will represent US interests. And if she finds value in India as an economic power, as a pluralistic power, as a democratic power, which fits in well with US's sort of national interests, then she would definitely engage with India in a much more pragmatic and realistic manner. I think that is how governments work, rather than trying to change each other's positions. And as always, Dr. Manmohan Singh once told his advisors that don't pay attention to presidential candidates in their election campaign, especially in the US. Pay attention to them once they come to office, which is what had happened with Barack Obama, who at one point was also seen to be critical of India. But once got to office, things changed for the better, especially in the second term. So I think all these things we have to keep in mind when we analyze and try to assess or gauge how Kamala Harris's vice presidency and Joe Biden's presidency would be for India.
And in the end, we talk about the Indian classical vocalist Pandit Jasraj, who passed away at his home in New Jersey on Monday following a cardiac arrest. Pandit Jasraj had represented the last of a generation of classical vocalists and had turned 90 in January this year. With a musical career spanning almost 80 years, he was a recipient of various prestigious awards and honors, including the Padma Shri, Padma Bhushan, and Padma Vibhushan. Many noted personalities, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, expressed grief and paid their last respects to him. Taking to Twitter, PM Modi said, "The unfortunate demise of Pandit Jasraj ji leaves a deep void in the Indian cultural sphere." In this segment, Suanshu Khurana, who writes on music and performing arts for the Indian Express, joins us to reflect on his life and talk about his legacy. Suanshu, Pandit Jasraj was one of the giants of Indian classical music and the last of a generation of classical vocalists. Could you talk about what exactly made him the giant that he was?
When we look at Hindustani classical music, Pandit Jasraj will be remembered as the last of a generation of some of the greatest classical musicians. He not only mastered the world of classical music that belonged to his gharana, he was also a pioneer who added elements of thumri to khayal, giving it more flexibility and making it more audience friendly. Now, this would have been considered blasphemous half a century ago when the khayal was serious business, and even the bandish would be sung with a certain indifference. So, Pandit Bhimsen Joshi, who was from Kirana Gharana and 8 years senior to Pandit Jasraj, too. In fact, he also took great things from other gharanas and included in his music to make it what it became later. But what Jasrajji did was probably a little more blasphemous for the musicians once upon a time. He introduced elements to make khayal sound like a tumri sometimes while still retaining its classical elements. Tumri is semi-classical, and once upon a time it used to be sung by the courtesans. So inclusion of those semi-classical genres into this pure classical form was uncomfortable for a lot of people. However, the purists do note that he never sang a tumri. So he also created unique jugalbandi style called Jasarangi, in which a male and female vocalist sing a different raga at the same time together. He also brought Haveli Sangeet to the fore. Now, this was the ancient classical form which originated from Drupad. So while he was touching the semi-classical Tumri there and merging it with Khayal, he was also interested in Drupad, now one of the oldest forms of classical music. What it tells us is that he didn't believe in segregation or this kind of elitism that comes with classical music. He believed that everything was for everyone, and he sang and created what he called music.
You mentioned his renunciation of elitism. What other things do you think made him stand out from others in the field?
Apart from being a great musician, he was very friendly on stage, unlike, for example, someone like Ishori Amonkar, who was extremely temperamental, or Pandit Bhimsen Joshi ji, who was brilliant, but then he was also blissfully unaware of his environment. So Pandit Jasraj was very involved with his audience. He would speak to them, he would look at them, he would take farmaish from them, something that classical musicians generally do not do. So I think these things really make him stand out from a lot of other musicians who were even better sometimes technically.
So his career spanned over nearly 80 years. In your piece about him for the paper, you write about stories and instances that shaped his long career. Could you recount some of them for our listeners?
So incidents came from life. His father passed away very early. He was only 4. So the family had to make ends meet. So he started playing tabla with his much older brother, and they would go for concerts. One of the incidents which fascinated him initially when he used to go to school was that there was a hotel that came on the way, and they were playing this record every day, which was by Begum Akhtar. The song was Diwana Banana Hai To Diwana Bana De, a very famed ghazal by her. And he would just stand there awestruck listening to this record at this hotel. And he'd not go to school. He'd sit there, eat his tiffin, and come back home. So that was, in a way, the first school for him. Begum Akhtar, who was called Akhtari by Faizabadi then, from listening to this ghazal from her. And then he started accompanying his brother since he was 11 and would go to concerts. Once upon a time, when he was going to do Sangat with his brother, the tabla was placed at the bottom of the pit in front of the stage. There used to be these pits where musicians used to sit and play while the performers were on the stage. And he asked the organizer as to why the tabla was not put on the stage. And he was scolded and told the tabla doesn't deserve to be up there on the stage. And he felt really bad about it. Um, this was one incident which sort of probably pushed him towards singing. And I think the nail in the coffin was the second one, where a very senior musician sort of reprimanded him after he spoke about a particular raga, and this musician told him that you have no right or no business talking about ragadari because you only pound dead flesh. Tum chamda peette ho. This is what he exactly said. This hurt him majorly. He was only 15 years old, and he decided to master the ragadari that this particular musician was talking about. He began learning from his elder brother. He later also trained under Swami Vallabh Das of the Agra Gharana, and that's where a shift happened from tabla to actual vocal training, where 14 aryas involved, and he became what he became later.
So, for those who might not be that familiar with his work or classical music for that matter, Is there anything that you could recommend that would be a good into his work?
So, there is this section of purely classical music, and there's this section of bhajans that he sings in the classical form. I mean, which is his repertoire, but he's taken these bhajans, and which is why he also became very famous, because he reached out to a lot of people and not just classical aficionados. So, one of the pieces which I've always been fascinated by is Mero Allah Meherban, which he composed back in 65 and at the peak of Indo-Pak War. And, he composed it in Rag Bhairav, which is known to be Lord Shiva's raga. It came out from his mouth, as the myth goes. So it's a very unique combination of Shiva and Allah. And back then it was really appreciated on both sides of the border. And when he sings it, he also merges Allah with Om. A very interesting secular composition. There is Mero Allah Meherban, this one, and then there is Mata Kalika, which is again an old composition, but very easy to approach for a person who's not a regular listener of classical music. Then there is Hanuman Lala, there is Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. These are compositions which are very easily approachable. So yeah, these can be tried to start with.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.